People think that ancient Egypt never changed in 3,000 years. And for those of us who study it, it changed constantly.
The ancient Egyptians never wrote history for history's sake. We end up having a totally different type of evidence once the ancient Egyptians start writing in full sentences.
People often like the idea of something being different. They don't want to think that the ancient Egyptians were in many ways like us.
So once you start studying ancient Egypt, you realize that not everything is represented the same, and not everything is a pyramid. You realize that there are these subtle shifts and changes, and you realize just how rich and deep this civilization is.
Even when we don't have new evidence, we have new questions to ask, new ways to look at the same old evidence.
Egyptologists always reinterpret artifacts in light of new information. That's one thing that we have to continuously do if we ever expect the field to move forward.
Most people, when they think of King Tut, think he was someone that we know a lot about because his tomb was found intact. But there's still a lot of mysteries.
He would have grown up in a palace, he would have had plenty of food to eat. He grew up with the best of the best at the time.
Tutankhamun, for me, reminds me that this little boy died and was buried with more gold than anybody can imagine.
There was so much change going on, and he came into power young. He was certainly pulled in a lot of directions by some very powerful adult figures. I imagine he was pulled in many directions and probably would rather have not have become pharaoh at all.
Most people, when they think of King Tut, think that he was an insignificant king, and nothing could be further from the truth. He was someone that we know a lot about because his tomb was found intact. But there's still a lot of mysteries. For example, did he rule in his own right? Was he a puppet? Who was his mother? What did he die of? The mummy of Tut gave us a lot of information. From the X-ray, we learned that he was not a really healthy specimen. He had a club foot, he had a cleft palate. Also, it seems that he might have suffered from bone necrosis. He probably was in a lot of pain during his life. In the 2010 DNA analysis, we also discovered that Tut's father was Akhenaten. Unfortunately, we do not know who Tut's mother was. The king had a number of different wives because his role on earth was to produce an heir, a spare, and hopefully a lot more than that, just to assure the continuation of the bloodline, but also the stability of the country.
You know, I think we know almost nothing about King Tut as a child. However, I think that we know enough about royal life in ancient Egypt at that time period to suppose that he certainly had a very comfortable childhood.
So King Tut was the son of a king. He would have grown up in a palace, he would have had plenty of food to eat, he would have had people all around him. In his tomb, he has this really cool little throne that he must have sat on when he was a toddler because of how tiny it is. Like, he grew up with the best of the best at the time.
Most kids, whatever they grow up with, that becomes their norm. At least while his family was still alive. Once he got a little bit older, he must have been kind of a scared little boy.
The facts that we know about Tut is that he was born in year 8 of Akhenaten's reign. Now, this was a very important year because this was the year that Akhenaten decided that he would erase the god Amun-Ra from the face of the earth. So he sent his people out to hack away anything having to do with the god Amun-Ra, anything having to do with gods, anything having to do with, other types of worship. And this was just to proclaim the Aten as the center of the world, center of religion. And this was a type of solar monotheism. Tut was steeped in this religion.
Akhenaten ends up creating a massive amount of chaos in the entire country. By shutting down the temples of Amun, you send everything into economic collapse within the country, and he wasn't a good international partner because he didn't respond. He destroyed the wealth, the borders, the international connections of the country that they had been building for hundreds of years before this point.
So this is the time that Tut grew up in. The other thing is that we know he probably was raised in the northern palace at Amarna, very sheltered childhood. He was likely taught didactic literature, or basically how to be a king, how to ride a chariot. I mean, basically the things that kings learn to do. Tut was growing up with some very strong women. Ti, who happened to be the wife of Amenhotep III, also Nefertiti, who was working in connection with Akhenaten on his religious reformation, and then also the woman that he would ultimately marry, Ankhesenaten, who later becomes Ankhesenamun. These are very strong women, and they are the ones who are used to controlling the reins of power along with their husbands. It's also interesting because I do have a feeling that these women controlled more than just what we know. Tut learned about diplomacy from watching his father, particularly in year 12. He watched his father and the tribute that came in from the northern part of the Egyptian vassal states to the southern Nubian territories. He saw just how much his father controlled of the known universe. He also, at that time, most likely watched his father in connection with Nefertiti ruling. And this ceremony likely brought out Nefertiti as a co-ruler for Akhenaten. Some of these foreign vassals brought in a pestilence, and it not only killed Ti, but it also killed 4 of Akhenaten's daughters.
It has been proposed that there was a significant plague going on in Egypt during a lot of this time period, and in fact, some people have thought that the founding of Amarna, in addition to being a way to build a city for Aten, was also a way to get away from the plague. And the Egyptians called the plague the Canaanite illness. They didn't want to blame it on Egyptians.
Akhenaten died in his year 17. It looks like the year before his death, he might have reigned with a really ephemeral king or perhaps queen named Smenkhara. And when he dies, Tut is still a child.
And when he came into power, it must have been really traumatic. And I tend to think he was rather scared. And I tend to think that probably he didn't have much say and didn't have much control.
It's clear that he was too young to sit on the throne. Enter Nefertiti.
Nefertiti almost certainly was a real Atenist. She is by his side from the very, very beginning. When Nefertiti began to rule, and I think she began to rule alongside her husband as Nefer-Neferu Aten, she was leveraging the power of her husband. He may very well have needed that help at that point. But once he had passed away, she seems to have dropped that epithet, and she ruled as Nefer-Neferu Aten, so she stepped into it to rule properly on her own.
So you have to understand that Atenism was a cult of personality. This is something that Akhenaten himself instituted. So it was clear without the personality, the cult would have a very, very hard time continuing. And so we're very sure that, in fact, Nefertiti ruled from 2 to 3 years, and she did this to kind of get everything together for Tut so that he could take the throne. Now, the question is, did she rule alongside Tut? I mean, that's open to interpretation, but we do know that Nefertiti took the throne after Akhenaten's death. So also at the end of Akhenaten's reign, and during the reign of Nefertiti, you had three individuals who were really juggling for power. You had Ai, who was the god's father, actually very close confidant of Tut. You had Horemheb, who was the chief general. And then you had Maya, who was the treasurer and the one who basically, controlled the coffers for the rebuilding of monuments in Egypt. They actually take on royal prerogatives. They take on royal titles, which is something that you would not find underneath a strong king. So this is what's led us to wonder, was Tut a puppet? Or was Tut just kind of pushed into the background while these people were kind of warring for control of Egypt?
Tutankhamun, when he took over the rule, it's hard to tell how much of the going back to the tradition was his choice and how much was not. Again, when there is a strong power structure and it suddenly gets removed, those people who originally had power, they want it back. They want it back, and by hook or by crook. It's often been said that there was a lot of incestuous marriage in ancient Egypt, but actually that wasn't oftentimes the case. The Egyptians had a lot less kinship terms than we use today. And the word, I don't know, in my day we used to say, hey bro, right? Which is short for brother. But it doesn't mean it was literally your brother. It was the same in ancient Egypt. They had very limited terms for brother, sister, niece, nephew, cousin. First of all, oftentimes it wasn't a blood relative at all. Secondly, if it was often, at most, it was a half-brother or sister, and it was for political reasons.
The rule was that you married your half-sister, because she would be the daughter of a different wife, but you had children by another wife who would be not from a direct brother-sister kind of connection. And the exceptions to this are quite few.
But when Tut assumes the throne, there are big changes that take place. First of all, they change their names. Ankhesepa-Aten turns into Ankhesenamun. Notice the difference between Aten at the end of the name and Amun at the end of the name. And Tut goes from Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun. So same thing is happening, just signaling that they are going back to the traditional worship of Amun-Ra and all the gods of Egypt. What's interesting about Tut, and also about Ankhesenamun, is that it seems that they tried to follow the same ideology that Nefertiti did, which was, let's appease the old worship, but let's continue Atenism. And the best way that we can see that is on the throne that has both the names Ankhesepa-Aten and Tutankhaten, and Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, all on the same throne. So they didn't erase those names. So it shows that they're still following Akhenaten's Atenism. In addition, Tut erected something called the Restoration Stela, and this was in the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, which is modern-day Luxor today. And on this monument, it talks about the material consequences of the Amarna age, psychological consequences, but more important, it puts out what Tut is going to do during his reign, and largely that is rebuild the monuments that had been destroyed, or the names on the monuments that had been destroyed during the reign of Akhenaten. He also finishes the monuments of his grandfather, Amenhotep III. Now, this is really interesting because he does this because he's allying himself to the last important king. And this also shows that Tutankhamun is the rightful heir to the throne.
When he decides to become Tutankhamun, I think that decision almost certainly was made for him. I think that I must have taken that responsibility to decide that if you want to actually keep this kingship going, you need to bring back the traditional gods.
In terms of the Restoration Stela being a thing that Tut dreamed up, probably not. Most likely this was something that was cooked up by, say, Ai or maybe even Horemheb. It was very important to them to bring the worship of the old gods back.
We can't know with any certainty about how Tut felt about his father's religion because he never wrote it down. But what we do see in his tomb is that when he reverted the religion back and brought in polytheistic religion again, he has tons of representations of Tut himself depicted in the guise of various gods. So there's King Tut as the god Amun. There's King Tut as the god Nefertem. There's King Tut following all of these different versions, fully embracing the polytheistic religion. Plus, King Tut changed his name from Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, his dad's god, to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. That's the god his dad hated the most. He's not Tutankhathor. He's not Tutankhathor. No, he's Tutankhamun. So I kind of see that as a mud in the face of his father.
When Tut comes to the throne, he abandons Amarna. And we know that Amarna is abandoned pretty quickly. Tut goes back to Memphis. He is crowned there. And in fact, he most likely lives in Memphis. What happens to Amarna is that it just goes back into the sands. The other thing that Tut does is that he dismantles monuments of his father, particularly a monument called the Gempa Aten. It is a temple that was to the Aten that was to the north of the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. He dismantles that and uses those blocks in his monuments. The blocks ended up in the temple of Luxor, and then also in Tut's mortuary temple. And these are interesting blocks because some of them depict wars against the Nubians, wars against the Asiatics. And so we're left with the question, did Tut fight these wars? Some Egyptologists believe it, and there's a lot to be said for that. So let me just explain this for a second. When they looked at Tut's mummy, X-rayed it, there was a recent break on one of Tut's femurs, and the embalming fluid had seeped into it. So it was clear that there was some accident that happened shortly before Tut died.
It's not at all uncommon for strong kings who are living in a period where warfare was necessary to be real military leaders. Not all of them were because it wasn't called for. He wasn't on the throne very long, and he was young, very young. Any attempt we make to try to make of him a military leader is frankly silly.
So, did this happen while he was at war? There is a letter from one of the Hittite kings that talks about an Egyptian king who died during a war or a battle at a place called Amuk, which is in Palestine. So we put it all together. Yes, it's very circumstantial evidence, but it's clear that Tut died of an accident, and it could have been gangrene that set in because of the broken femur. Tut seems to have reigned from 7 to 9 years, which is a very short amount of time when you think, for example, that Ramses II ruled for 66 years. Another thing that was done when you took the throne was that your tomb was started. And it's clear that the tomb that was intended for Tut was on the western valley of the King's Valley, number 23. He dies suddenly, and that tomb is not done. So instead, they go ahead and bury him in what we call KV, or King's Valley 62. And that was actually intended for a non-royal person. He is buried not only with his material, but material from Smenkhare, material from Nefertiti, even from Akhenaten.
Even his own tomb has Eye burying him, right? And so he didn't even manage to be the only royal actor in his own tomb.
After Tut's death, his wife, Ankhesenamun, is left with no heirs, and she's sitting on the throne. It's clear that either Eye or Horemheb are going to be her husband. So what does she do? She writes the Hittite king, and she says, "You have many sons. I would like one of your sons to sit on the throne of Egypt by my side. Never will a servant become my husband. Which is interesting because both I and Horemheb were not royal. So the king kind of stalls. He's thinking, I'm not so sure about this. This seems like a trap. And the fact that he stalls is really bad because when he ultimately sends his son, Zazaza, he's killed along the way, probably by the agents of I or Horemheb. So we don't have an heir for Ankhesenamun. We think she was married to I, but she just fades at that point. We don't hear anything about her. So after Tut dies, I takes the throne. Now, I was already really old at this point, so he only rules for about 4 years. He ends up being buried in the tomb that was originally to belong to Tut, which is the Western Valley 23. Then when he dies, Horemheb comes to power, and he erases everything having to do with the Amarna period, with Tut, with I. He just takes the throne and just wipes it clean.
In ancient Egypt, I think that those kings that were strongly remembered, frankly, had left something that was totally visible. Khufu built the Great Pyramid. Khufu was never forgotten in ancient Egypt. And then you have Ramses II. He was remembered just because he was Ramses the Great. He built everything. And if he didn't build it, he stole it from somebody and put his own name on it. So it looked like he built it. The name of Tutankhamun was largely replaced on monuments by Horemheb. We know now that this was a very common approach that the Egyptians had to fixing mistakes that they made or putting in new information that they wanted to change.
So the ancient Egyptians never wrote history for history's sake. If they wanted an event to be remembered, something that was good enough to commemorate, they would depict it on a wall or write about it in a stele and then gift it to a god. So we always have this very skewed version of history. Tutankhamun had been erased or he had been usurped. He was primarily usurped by Horemheb, but the event of switching back his dad's religion, of changing things back to the way it had been prior to him, wasn't erased. That was celebrated.
Because of what Horemheb did, you don't find Tut's name in the king list. You don't find Akhenaten's name in the king's list. You don't find Nefertiti's name in the king's list. You have all these names inside of his tomb, which is one of the things that makes this tomb so incredibly important, is because this is a very shadowy time in ancient Egyptian history. So we are, based on these burial goods, we are able to slightly reconstruct what might have happened. So Tut's tomb was lost and forgotten because 180 years later, Ramses VI builds above his tomb and completely buries it under all of the earth rock that has been excavated in order to create his tomb. Carter had excavated in the King's Valley for many years. And what he did is he identified literally a triangle of space that had not been excavated. What he did is when he started excavating it, he found workmen's huts. So right then and there, he thought, anything below this has not been disturbed, because why would they put workmen's huts, on top of a tomb? And he was looking for Tut. He knew Tut's tomb was there. He digs down more, and lo and behold, he finds stairs. And the stairs leading to the burial chamber of Tut. Tut's tomb still had the necropolis seals on them. So he knew what he found had not been disturbed. What was found in Tut's tomb? Everything. And I gotta say that so much that it has not received scientific publication. This was a time that we know so little about, and we're always looking for more clues to understand what happened after Akhenaten. If we hadn't had Tut's tomb, There's so much we would not understand about royal burials and royal burial culture. This was the best preserved tomb that was found in New Kingdom history.
Archaeology is one of those things that is a remarkable tool in terms of our learning about history. So we change our views on things constantly and refresh all the time. Even when we don't have new evidence, we have new ways, new questions to ask, new ways to look at the same old evidence.
Egyptologists always reinterpret artifacts in light of new information. That's one thing that we have to continuously do if we ever expect the field to move forward. It is a lot of fun to be able to reinterpret artifacts and evidence in a new light, or put together the puzzle in a new way to come up with a truer version of history.
The one thing that we did learn from Tut's burial was the preservation of the body. And it wasn't just the mummification of the body. It was all of the shrines that the body was contained in. And so you had not only a number of coffins, you had a stone sarcophagus, you had a series of shrines. Nobody was going to get in there to disturb the king's body.
I honestly think that King Tut should be most remembered for his stuff. I mean, his tomb really is beautiful, and I'm not just talking about the mask. I mean, there are so many hidden gems in his tomb. Not just stones, which there are too, but things like Tutankhamun's trumpets, his bow and arrow collection, his underwear. I mean, we learned so much about how things actually worked in the past that we learn from his tomb and are able to apply to other parts of society.
Tut should be remembered because his was not an insignificant reign. He brought back the worship of the old gods. He was likely involved with keeping Ottonism, but slowly letting it go away. His life was short and sad. He knew the pain of losing children. He rebuilt monuments that had been destroyed by his father. He brought back the priesthoods. This was the order of Egypt.
So I think that King Tut's biggest achievement was actually reverting back all the changes his dad made. But that was the one achievement that all the later pharaohs wanted to basically control.
This was a time that we know so little about, and we're always looking for more clues to understand what happened after Akhenaten. First thing that comes to mind when I hear the name Akhenaten, heretic.
Akhenaten was weird. He was a strange, odd guy who just simply was different from everybody else.
And of all the pharaohs in Egyptian history, he seems to create great divides. Even in eminent scholars who are otherwise well-balanced will either hate him with a really vehement passion or hold him up in this great light.
What sets Akhenaten apart is his sheer willingness to destroy the entire world around him to get everything he wants.
Akhenaten was the king of Egypt who came to the throne around 1350 BC, or maybe a few years before. But he's known because he was in many ways one of the strangest people who ever came out of ancient Egypt. He believed in a god that no one else had ever recognized as a god, the sun in the sky during the day that he called the Aten. He believed that the Aten was the light in the air and the creative force of sunlight. And so his theology was really a non-theology. It said to people, he created us, and when he dawns, you will live. And when the sun sets, you're just going to lie there, unmoving, until it dawns again. it wasn't a well-developed theology, but it was, I think, what he personally experienced and wanted to be truthful about.
Bear in mind that the sun, Ra, had always been front and center in Egypt. All you have to do is go to Egypt and realize why that's the case. But Atenism was proclaiming one God above others, but it was a God that had been there for a very, very long time. It was the sun's disk. But the only way to worship the Aten was through Akhenaten.
So he was the only one who could interpret his God for the people. And that was a new vision, because the Egyptian king had been always the son of Re, the son of the sun god, since the 4th dynasty. But now, being the only son of the Aten, who was literally created, it says, out of the sun's rays, out of Aten's rays, it meant that only he could both interpret but also give any of that power that Aten had to anyone else. And he chose to give it only directly to his own family, to his wife Nefertiti and to his daughters. Everyone else had to get what they got from the Aten by way of praying to Akhenaten and his family.
Akhenaten worshipped the Aten. That was his main god. But he did not deny the existence of other gods. He just ignored them. So whether you want to call it monotheism or henotheism, doesn't really matter.
One of the things that people have a hard time understanding is that Egyptian religion was always more complicated than simply having a lot of gods. It was really closest to what we might call animism, in the sense that they believed that everything, the ground, the metals that they got out of the ground, everything had a spiritual capability. It had a divine force. And so all gods actually came from the same spiritual power. And for that reason, they could actually all be combined together in some ways. And Akhenaten's father, in many ways, believed that all the gods could be represented together as one, and that Akhenaten just flipped that on its side and decided that one god was really all that was needed to have all of that energy that was known throughout Egypt. The Egyptians had such a great system before Atenism, because you could literally tailor a god to suit your personal situation. And you could call up that god in that situation if it was somebody who cures blindness or a particular kind of dysentery that you happen to have. Here, you have only one choice, and so it is quite literally putting all your eggs in one basket. And if Aten doesn't turn out to be fulfilling everything, then by means of Akhenaten, then you're out of luck.
So it's interesting, again, how Akhenaten is treated in terms of religion changes dramatically through the decades and centuries, and depending on who is writing. Sometimes he's touted as being a complete monotheist, which obviously he was not, because he includes other deities in his beautiful poetry that he may or may not have written.
Akhenaten's changes were absolutely shocking and revolutionary. And it wasn't because he just decided to worship the Aten. Nobody cares who he's worshiping. It's because it changed a lot of the world around him.
So when he came to the throne, his father had laid some of the groundwork. And in fact, there is some evidence building up now to suggest that there was even perhaps a temple to Aten being built on the west side of the Nile, even before Amenhotep III, his father, passed away. But it was Akhenaten himself, and at least his followers, who turned Aten into a true god. And that happened early in his reign, within the first 3 years. Well, in year 5, he starts to motivate people and find people who would like to move to the new city that he was founding in the middle of Egypt. It was to be the home for his God, and that he had looked and looked until he found a place that was absolutely virgin territory, that it belonged to no other god or goddess before this time. And that was important because that meant that no other god or goddess could make a claim on any of the people or any of what was produced there.
Because the city of Amarna has been so well excavated for decades now, we actually have a pretty good idea of what the different people who lived in the city of Amarna practiced and what they did in light of Akhenaten's religion.
The city was probably occupied for no more than 15 years at the most. And we think that it probably grew. I mean, no one has a good, perfect estimate. So the estimates are somewhere between 25 and 50,000 people, with as many as 3,000 houses that could have been accommodated during that time. They were definitely coming to Amarna to try and come up in the world, status-wise, money-wise, closeness to the king, closeness to power is always a drug for people. So over those 5 years, he had found new priests. He had found new elites to fill up his court. Now, he probably brought people from Memphis and elsewhere, but certainly it has to have largely been a cast of characters that he was grooming in his Theban location to take them up north. He suddenly made many people into actual wealthy, propertied people who could then enjoy that with their families. And I don't think it was hard for him to find followers. But when they did that, they left behind the rest of their family. So it was only nuclear families that we find that are accommodated in Amarna. And so there was pretty clearly an isolationism that had happened for the people of Amarna.
Akhenaten did change the entire upper level of the administration to be his yes men. And a lot of these yes men chose to have the term Aten in their name. They chose to be buried at Amarna. And even if you look at their houses, basically on their front porch, they would have a little shrine to worshiping not the Aten, but to Akhenaten and the royal family. Because in Atenism, only Akhenaten and the royal family could worship the Aten, and then everybody else had to worship him. One of these shrines would show how devoted you were, but it was a means of showing a political religious affiliation.
The whole belief that the ideology of the Aten was, front and center, of course, in Tel el-Amarna, but we have reason to believe through, various evidence that it wasn't practiced exclusively. And in fact, even at Amarna, in the workman's village, they had images of household gods, like the god Bes. So people were raised in a polytheistic religion. To throw that out the window completely probably just wasn't done.
Some of the nobility followed along. Forget what I'm doing at home, it doesn't really matter, but I'm gonna do this in public and stay on his good side because I wanna be promoted and progress in my life in that way with work. And again, Amarna itself was a very small, isolated location in the middle of Egypt. In a lot of the rest of Egypt, some things continued the same. And I imagine, again, sort of the less elite, the less literate, the more things would just keep on going the way they always had.
Now, for ordinary people, who were farmers most of the time, maybe the people that they sold their grain to changed, maybe their taxation structure changed. There probably would have been some implications because the economy essentially collapses. But on the international stage, it is very shocking and revolutionary because all of these international kings and queens were talking to each other at the time. So the kings at this time would actually send each other international presents. They would send boatloads of gifts to each other. And Akhenaten becomes this unreliable, unstable partner who was not giving stuff away like his dad did. This changes all of international trade and politics.
Egypt, bear in mind, had moved its boundaries well into Syria and then to the south, well into Sudan or ancient Nubia. He just wasn't particularly interested. And the problem is that you have the rise of some very warlike, cultures, for example, like the Hittites and the Mitanni, and they're like bearing down on Egypt. They're just incurring all this wrath and skirmishes, just basically just nipping at the boundaries of Egypt's power.
Akhenaten ends up creating a massive amount of chaos in the entire country. By shutting down the temples of Amun, you send everything into economic collapse within the country. He even reappropriated the entire Egyptian army to, instead of defend the borders, they were running around the country like scratching out the name of Amun in all of these random places. He destroyed the wealth, the borders, the international connections of the country that they had been building for hundreds of years before this point.
Akhenaten was more concerned with his revolutionary religion. He just pretty much turned a blind eye to what was going on in the larger Egyptian world. I mean, in year 12, when there was a huge tribute ceremony where people from all the vassal states came in to give offerings to Akhenaten, the dramatic event that followed that tribute ceremony in year 12 of Akhenaten was likely a plague. Some of these foreign vassals brought in a pestilence, and it not only killed T, but it also killed 4 of Akhenaten's daughters. What we've been finding, particularly in the workmen's village at Tel El Amarna, is that it was, in fact, the Black Death.
He created his own theology, his own religion, and he built a whole new city. He moved his family and a large population to this new city. He created a new art style, and all of that in 17 years on the throne.
Akhenaten was the son of the Aten. So, of course, if he's a god, he's got to be unusual. The Amarna art style is radically different from what came before. The pharaoh before was always represented as a vigorous young man, even if he happened to be old. In the Amarna period, you just blow that apart. Essentially, the king is focusing on his uniqueness.
His approach to the art style was radical, because the Egyptians had always had a practice of depicting the human body mathematically proportioned. Akhenaten came in, and suddenly the proportioning of the body is completely different. Now you have a long neck, you have a very long, almost horse-like shaped face, you have a barrel-shaped abdomen, a tiny little waspy waist, huge swollen hips, and short stick-like legs. So the body looks nothing like the human body that had been represented in Egypt for many, many hundreds of years. We don't have any idea how he came up with this particular proportioning of the human body. Some people have suggested that he had a particular kind of eye problem, a retinal problem, that caused him to actually squint in such a way that he thought that that's the way people looked. We don't know, but we do know that the greatest artists from Amarna stayed in their on their monuments that the king himself taught them how to draw. So it was his art, and it was his choice.
Temple architecture also changes because before you had temples where the floor would ascend and the roof would descend, and that the most powerful area in the temple was the Holy of the Holies, where, of course, the statue was placed. And this statue was enlivened through various rituals. And every day, came to life. During the Amarna period, you have temples that are open to the sun. Essentially, they do away with small, dense, dark, holy of the holies place. Instead, it's open to the sun because what is the sun? It's the Aten. There is one of the Amarna letters talks about an emissary coming in from the northern lands or the Asiatic lands. And he's just complaining about the king makes us stand in the sun all the time, which of course, is in keeping with Akhenaten's religion. But in Amarna, in the summer, it is blindingly hot. One has to wonder about, heat exhaustion, simply because if you're waiting while the king is conducting his ritual, that would be something that would be a little irksome.
Because Akhenaten was in many ways what we might think of as a scholar, or he certainly thought he was a scholar, and his whole reign he spent teaching people about this new religion. So he would write these long decrees and have them put on stone and written up. And in his new city, he had a whole series of these things placed around and sort of to make the boundaries of his new city.
And it really is about, when you read the Great Hymn to the Aten, it's about the rays of the Aten and how it wakes the world up, so that you have a lot of the art having to do with the natural beauty of the world, because this is what is reflected in the Aten's rays. Akhenaten died in his year 17. It looks like the year before his death, he might have reigned with a really ephemeral king or perhaps queen named Smenkhare. And when he dies, Tut is still a child. Enter Nefertiti. We're very sure that, in fact, Nefertiti ruled from 2 to 3 years, and she did this to kind of get everything together for Tut so that he could take the throne.
And we really don't know anything at all about his death or his passing, but we do know that that there is indications that there is another ruler already in waiting, as it were, who would continue. Akhenaten does seem to have had at least one, if not two, co-regents. There was a king Smenkhare. I think that he probably was a older brother of Tutankhamun, and that he reigned earlier in Akhenaten's reign and passed away young. And but then I think Akhenaten took a second co-regent, who was Nefer-Nefru Aten, and that was actually Nefertiti, who became a ruler briefly until her own passing, and then we have Tutankhamun. Akhenaten built a huge tomb for himself. There are several other tombs in the royal wadi as well, but none of them really show us burials. And what we end up with is evidence that in the time of Tutankhamun, what burials had taken place were removed and transported back to the Valley of the Kings in Thebes. The name of Akhenaten was already considered to be anathema, something to be removed in the same way that he had removed the god Amen's name. His buildings, are still there. They were just torn down, but they didn't make the effort to always completely remove his name. Where you find it is on things like the Talatat, which are just small blocks from a temple. When it was on something large, then they had been attacked. So it's not all that difficult to re-find him, but standing monuments were not left. Like if you go to Amarna today and you see his boundary stele, they're still quite prominent. But of course, wherever his name was has got a big mark through it.
I think some of the biggest lingering questions of the Amarna period is about what happened outside of Amarna and Thebes. The majority of our evidence is from Amarna, and then we have a bunch of evidence from Thebes. But honestly, we don't know what happened in the rest of the country.
When Akhenaten dies, you have to understand that Atenism was a cult of personality. This is something that Akhenaten himself instituted. So it was clear without the personality, the cult would have a very, very hard time continuing. When Tut comes to the throne, he abandons Amarna. And we know that Amarna is abandoned pretty quickly.
After Akhenaten's downfall, a lot of people changed their names. So people name things like Mary Aten would change their name to Mary Ray or Mary Horus, and they would often take out the Aten in their name, in the same way that Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, or Ankhesenpa'aten changed her name to Ankhesenamun.
I suspect that for the more ordinary ancient Egyptians, the farmers out in a field somewhere out by Saqqara in Lower Egypt or further down south, I suspect that they just continued their merry little existence without having a clue as to what was going on in the political world. The people who mainly seemed to have really despised Akhenaten were those who had had their power taken away. They seemed to be the ones really intent on damning his memory and him during his life.
One of the enduring mysteries of the Amarna period is why? Why? Where did this idea come from? Some people think that it might have been that Akhenaten was greatly influenced by his father, Amenhotep III, who later in his reign deifies himself, becomes a god, and refers to himself as Egypt's dazzling sun.
A lot of times people suggest that Akhenaten wasn't quite sane, but when you look just at what he wrote and what he did, I don't think he was all that different, but he never sounded insane to me at all. He never sounded like he had lost his grasp on reality. He just had a different vision of reality. What happens with Akhenaten is he sort of takes it to the extreme. He was young. He kind of maybe took it a little far.
I personally think that he was very clever and not insane for most of his life. But I think that he did show signs, perhaps, of having gone too far into the extreme towards the end of his life. His almost overreach may have dampened people's belief that kingship was there by divine order in order to keep divine order.
I think the change to Atenism was an extremely unique change in Egyptian history and in Egyptian religion, and there probably wasn't a more powerful shift religiously until the Romans essentially outlawed polytheistic religion.
We really have trouble understanding what the ultimate impact of Atenism was on Egypt. But I think that there is some indication for us that there was a negative impact. So it may not be Atenism that had the impact, but it may have been Akhenaten himself